Do you see any changes in the industry because of GenAI?
A few. It's completely a paradigm shift in my mind. Trying to find founders that are building the right technologies at the right time with the right reasons, it's a challenge, but it's a fun one because you get to know people and kind of move from there. I had decided when I was 7 years old I was going to be a radiologist. I don't like any of this, the blood, the touching people, and the close proximity of how can we cure this disease. I'm confident that we will be there very soon. I'm a big believer in just bringing good people together.
Hi everyone, welcome to Nashville, and today we have another amazing episode of Digital Health Interviews. And today we have an incredible guest. This person is associated with healthcare and health tech all around the country. When I ask someone like, who do you know in Nashville? And everybody's like, we know this person. So today we're interviewing Kavya Sharman. Hi Kavya.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. Great.
How did you make this happen that everybody knows you and associates you with health tech in Nashville, specifically you? Because that's literally everybody I ask, like, hey, do you know anyone in Nashville? Like, we know Kavya.
Oh my gosh, that's very kind, and I had no idea. I'm a big believer in just bringing good people together. And so when people ask, how I'm thinking about the events, which is probably where I've met a lot of great people, the number one thing that I focus on is just, are you a good human? What are you building? What are you excited about? And you can see that in a lot of our events. And the thing that I tell people also, the only rule at my events, no pitching or selling. Come be a human, tell me your story. We're all here to make money. I want to make money, you want to make money. But ultimately, if we can come into these conversations with something that we're excited about, it's amazing. You just see people's shoulders drop. And they get excited and fired up and, oh my gosh, we're gonna save people doing this, we're gonna build this cancer treatment, and you can see that light in their eyes. And when somebody else sees that light in their eyes, and then you feel that excitement in what you're doing, and suddenly those conversations are elevated. And so I think that energy resonates with people, especially after the last few years where we have been so isolated. And I think now where people have a chance to come together, be excited about what they spent most of their life doing, and just having a chance to be seen and engage in these discussions, I think it resonates with people. So honestly, I like to bring people together, and then I sit back and just kind of observe, and that's it.
Tell us your amazing story. How did you get here?
Completely by accident, all of it. So
like me.
I had decided when I was 7 years old I was going to be a radiologist, and I stuck with that until about sophomore year of undergrad.
Wait, what made you make that decision when you were 7?
I do know. I wanted a career that was protected and safe and had money, and I didn't have to touch people. And so I went back and I thought, well, radiology sounds great. I'll sit in a room, look at images, and tell people if they have a broken bone or not. And I thought it was great.
Makes sense.
And I liked that until a couple of things happened. One, I started to realize that I really wanted to impact people at scale. The other thing that happened was I shadowed in a hospital, and I was like, oh, I don't like any of this. The blood, the touching people, and the close proximity. I was like, okay, maybe there's something else. And around that time, I had just started at Vanderbilt as an undergrad, and somebody had told me a long time ago that nanotechnology was the future. And I said, okay, great. At the time, I was studying biology, and I ended up finding this lab that was building these interesting nanoparticles to treat brain cancer by delivering gene therapy. And so I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And so I started that, and it was really fun. And around that time, I decided to major in neuroscience because I liked the way that people thought, but I wanted to put science behind that and figure out what molecular underpinnings were different for you and me and why it made us think the way that we did. And so I jumped into the neuroscience, and then they said, well, you have to pick a neurolab. And I said, well, I don't want to leave what I'm doing. Can I just take these nanoparticles and put them in the brain? And to my surprise, they were like, sure. So I built out a research study and kind of got into that process, and that that study the process of bringing one really interesting technology into another space. I was wrapped up in it, and I didn't know what an entrepreneur was. I didn't know what business was at that point. I had started taking some business classes for fun, and all of that really just steered me into this direction of business and entrepreneurship, but at the same time, how do we take these really interesting opportunities and scientific technologies and take them out of the market?
That's fascinating. At which point did you realize that you want to be on the investment side?
Oh, it took me a few turns.
Okay.
So when I finished my undergrad work, I really enjoyed that, and I had spent a lot of time understanding this innovation landscape. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up, and a mentor of mine said, well, why don't you come work for me for a bit? I said, great. Turns out he was a vice chair of business development at Vanderbilt Medical Center, so I got to work with some of the leading innovators in informatics. That was early in data, big data, precision medicine, and how are we taking all of these massive data sets and using it to improve care. So that was really fun, but the coolest thing is I got to understand how innovation ecosystems work, and how do we take academic information and data again out into the real world. So spent a lot of time there. I was trying to again figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up. Ended up joining a startup through another mutual connection, and wore a lot of different hats. It's probably the most fun I had, but I was more on the operator side of things. Mm-hmm. And I started to learn how to code simply because I was working with a lot of data, and I would go to the engineers and say, hey, can you help me analyze this? And after a while doing that back and forth, I said, hey, I'm just gonna do it myself. So I did the thing I said I would never do. I taught myself how to code in MATLAB, which I didn't love, sorry if you're using MATLAB. I switched to Python as soon as I could. But I realized
that was before vibe coding.
It was early
right.
days, early days. And it was a lot of fun, but then I realized I kind of hit that natural ceiling of the self-taught world, and I said, okay, I really want a stronger foundation. So came back to Vanderbilt to study data science, and that was my PhD. But at the same time, I knew I was gonna go back into business, but I started making some friends who had spent time in the investment side of things. And so we built a small investment fund, very humble AUM, but the idea was our students were LPs, and we invested in publicly traded biotech companies. And the thesis was using our scientific knowledge to basically outcompete Wall Street. And we had some fun stories out of that. It was so much fun. I was learning how to do DCFs by night, and by day I was coding and doing all the analyses. It was the most fun I had. And so that kind of got me into the investment side, but it was more in the public. And again, I knew I wanted to go back into the early stage startup space. And so I started working for a small VC firm while I was wrapping up my postdoc, and that kind of got me into the venture side of things.
Interesting. Well, we'll talk more about Phase Capital a little later. First, I want to ask you to define TechBio and Biotech. When I came to Boston last year, I was checking like all kind of events happening there, and they were like, oh, this is a biotech event. This is a TechBio event. I'm like, wait, is that different? Tell us, is that different, and what does that mean?
Yeah, it's completely a paradigm shift in my mind. So truly, TechBio, a term of art, is the way that I think about it. So going back to biotech first. So biotech, when I think about biotech, it's truly, the truest definition is taking something from biology, taking it out of the biological system, engineering it in some way, and then putting it back into the body for better. And that is the truest definition of biotechnology in my mind. When I think about TechBio, it's truly, instead of going after this with a specific biological question in mind, you're starting with the data or the technology or the artificial intelligence infrastructure and saying, okay, here are all of the data points that we have. Where can we go from here? And in translation into companies, what that ends up being, and these are truly tech companies, except instead of a B2B SaaS model, or it might be a B2B SaaS model, their B at the end of that business to business is pharma companies or other biotech companies that are doing drug discovery. But to give you an example, there's some companies that are doing some really interesting work building AI for gene editing or drug discovery. And what's cool is that they're not building the actual drug or the therapeutic themselves. They're partnering with the pharma companies or the biotech companies to help that process. And so when I think about drug discovery from this earliest stage all the way through clinical trials, it is a linear process that typically takes 10 to 15 years. At each of those stages, there's an inflection point, and companies that can solve issues or problems or optimize at those inflection points are the companies that I would define as TechBio. And I say all of that, and then I'm going to flip it and say, honestly, TechBio definition will change depending on who you ask. And so there's always that.
I think I understand, but for me to better understand, can you give us 2 examples for, well, I guess for biotech it's kind of obvious now, but for TechBio, like some products that are good examples of this industry?
Yeah, I can give you, well, one of our portfolio companies was a spin out from Colossal Biosciences. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're bringing the woolly mammoth back.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the right response. So what's fun, they actually have brought back or engineered a woolly mouse. It is the cutest thing I've ever seen. It's scurrying around. But what was cool was they essentially inserted woolly genes into this mouse. And the idea is to take elephants and essentially elephant embryos and insert genes and kind of bring back the woolly mammoth. The technology, the gene editing technology that they used was a combination of, true wet lab science, but then also an AI machine learning algorithm that helps them understand and predict how they could do that gene editing, right? So that technology was spun out into a company called FormBio, and so we invested in their Series A recently. And what's really interesting about them is, again, they're partnering with biopharma or pharmaceutical companies, biotech startups that are building drug discovery. But their premise is, instead of something that historically takes 2 to 3 years, 5 million to get to that early stage candidate discovery, what if we were able to integrate large data sets from data that we have collected and reduce that search space and make those early stage candidates basically get a smaller list? And there's a little bit of a caveat there. There's a lot of companies that focus on that earliest stage. What I liked about FormBio and companies in this space that are really thinking about it, I think, in the interesting way, is not only are they integrating at that earliest stage, but they're integrating manufacturing data, safety data, toxicity data that comes from real world mass spectrometry experiments, for instance. And so what they're doing is integrating the data at every step of the way, so that when they give you these 10 candidates, they've pre-screened for company or for candidates that might fall apart in the phase 3, which for gene therapy, if you've been seeing the news, that's typically where they end up failing. So that's an example of TechBio.
What's the business model for that business?
The business model essentially has a few different opportunities. So one is just B2B SaaS fee for service model, but then there's also milestone types of payments, and then later on there's revenue sharing opportunities once the client
Makes sense.
get to the
All
end.
right. So you were in TechBio space before all the hype of GenAI started, right? How do you think do you see any changes in the industry because of GenAI?
A few.
A few?
A few. I mean, for one, during my PhD, I remember my boss and I, we literally were talking about one of the experiments, and I was writing out a principal component analysis by hand to trace where all of those were going. And so truly, like at that time, we were, building all of that by hand. Now with vibe coding or all, it would have, I don't know. On one side, I'm really glad I got that baseline knowledge and I can understand that. On the other side, I'm thinking of all the interesting experiments I could have run if I was like, run a principal component analysis and do this factorization and do da-da-da. And then being able to do that at that scale and speed, I think would have really made a difference potentially to my PhD and kind of what we studied. So short answer is yes, there's a lot of different changes. But and the other thing too is just the speed at which we're able to do these analyses. When I was doing this, and it was not that long ago, but truly even to run a model on one imaging data set, for example, would take a course of 24 hours to build and train. And half of my time was spent, how do we chunk the data in ways that we can, take a small piece, analyze it, and then go back into the model instead of trying to digest the whole thing at once. Whereas now the compute pace is just, it's just unreal. It takes seconds, minutes.
So I agree, speed is definitely an important one. But do you think, how far are we from the point when AI can actually come back not just with the task that you ask it to do, but actually with some new ideas? Hey, maybe you should experiment with something this, and it's gonna actually, something that a person didn't think about it, but it's gonna help, find a cure for something or something like that. How far are we from that point?
I think we're there. There
Really?
are companies right now that are building in that space. Because if you think about large language models being able to process hundreds of thousands of terabytes of data, for instance, and if you think about all the publications, typically, like as a grad student, we're going out, we're looking and citing probably the same 7 to 10 authors that are in our space. And of course, we'll do the data search and make sure that we're not overlapping. But there are going to be manuscripts that are missed or something that were published in a different language or a different country. I think what's really interesting to your point is that now GenAI can digest all this information and potentially find things that were overlooked or relations that were previously unseen. And the other thing too that's really interesting is in terms of signal to noise, being able to find some of those connections and opportunities and correlations that might be buried. Historically, I spent a lot of time making sure, I was normalizing my data so I could compare A to A and B to B, even if the A signal was like this and then the B signal was just up and down in this kind of smaller space. And I think with the way that we can use GenAI and this multidimensional thinking, we can find some of those connections that humans historically have just not been able to do.
But still, I think you're talking about something else. You're talking about like AI is gonna go analyze all the data out there and find something that a person could potentially miss and just bring this out, say, hey, you didn't find this paper when you did the research. But I was more interested in when you have this normal chatbot conversation, like asking, doing different tasks, and then the chatbot actually responds. Have you thought of trying this sequence, or have you tried to do something? So it actually comes back with some new ideas, like that a person not just miss in the data, but never thought about.
Yeah, no, I think we're speaking that same language. Like these connections that we're finding kind of build out that funnel, and then to your point, the next query, like, where can we go from here? Those questions, those hypotheses are going to be new and interesting. Then the question, of course, is parsing those and what's real and what's not and what's hallucination. And
I'm not even a little bit afraid to ask this, but does that mean that very soon we're going to hear some breaking news that, hey, we found the cure for this, we found the cure for this, and in 10, 20 years, we basically can tackle most of the conditions, chronic conditions and diseases out there?
So I would say yes, but how is the question?
Okay.
So early on, when I was really diving into data science, the thing that made me really excited was the systems biology approach. So early on when I was studying the glioblastoma, that was the cancer I was focused on, we were focused on one disease pathway, in fact, one gene and one point mutation, one DNA mismatch that was implicated in 11 out of the 14 glioblastomas that we were studying. So the idea was if we can go in and fix that early on, then we can attenuate the development of the cancer. Cancer in general, and we're seeing more of these studies, but truly it's a systems approach, right? And understanding the body and levels of stress and cortisol and the hormones that are raging through our entire system when something is disrupted, like as a result of cancer, for instance. And then you have the immune system that's pushing against, and then you complicate that more with medications, and now you have this war happening inside the body. We have not had a way to really study or analyze that. Even if people have had these ideas early on, we just didn't have the compute power. And so when you're thinking, how can we cure this disease? I'm confident that we will be there very soon, but exactly how, I think the solutions either don't exist or we can't even fathom how they might exist. But just being able to understand the complexity that is going on within our systems now and where I'm seeing the growth happening and the speed at which it's happening. I mean, every single day there's a new publication, there's new, Anthropic is coming out with a new thing. There's so much innovation, it's happening so quickly. So all that to say, yes, I'm confident and optimistic that we'll have some interesting cures in the next 10, 20 years. Cannot tell you how.
That's insane. Can you imagine living in a world without diseases?
I'm sure we'd find something else to stress us out with.
Actually, I was going to ask. I'm sure that AI capabilities can also be used for harm. And is there a chance of, another pandemic because of that? Because somebody created something bad?
I'm going to say yes and then leave it at that.
All right, fair enough. Phase Capital, tell us more about it. You're the founding partner, correct?
I'm the founding partner. I have a co-founder, Kristen Johns. And we invest in early stage TechBio. By early, I mean pre-seed, seed, some opportunistic Series A. And we like to invest with other funds. And we spend a lot of time across the coast. So we're headquartered here in Nashville, but we invest across the US. And that's why I spend a lot of time in other cities too, and why I'm excited to connect with founders. Because what I've realized is, and this is just across the US, I mean, if we expand it to the globe, it's a different story, but every ecosystem has its own strength. And what I've loved, again, just bringing good people together, but also bringing ecosystems together and finding a really great founder in Chicago who, by the way, should meet an investor in New York, and maybe they should connect with this genius engineer who's based in Austin, and just kind of building more of that ecosystem. So all that to say, we invest in early stage founders. I really love working with the founders at that early stage when the idea and the technology is still being developed, but then the next stage of, okay, who do we speak with, how do we scale, how do we build up partnerships and collaborations, and that strategy is really fun. So that's where we like to
Tell
like
me,
to play.
what's harder, to convince people, LPs, to give you money to the fund, or to find those brilliant ideas that you want to invest in?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. No one's ever asked me that before. Honestly, I would say it is the founders, because LPs understand, new market, new opportunity. It would be, foolish not to invest in this next phase of growth. No, well, pun kind of intended. But trying to find founders that are building the right technologies at the right time with the right reasons, it's a challenge, but it's a fun one because you get to know people and kind of move from there. That was a great question.
Oh, actually, to follow that up, how much time, percentage-wise, would you spend on fundraising yourself for the fund and working with startups, either already companies in your portfolio or potential leads?
Right now it's 50-50,
Okay.
but I think as time goes on, we will likely be spending probably 80% looking and talking with founders and creating events and opportunities for them to connect and for us to meet with them and get to know them. So I think that'll shift moving forward.
In-person events is the biggest lead generation for you channel, or what do you use to find those founders?
Yeah, I mean, we love JP Morgan and some of those larger events, and like partnering with people that are hosting big conferences, and sometimes we'll do a Biotech breakfast or a Frontiers pop-up, something like that. But yeah, I think those in-person connections are truly great because, again, complexity, systems biology, just when you get to meet a person in person, it just changes the dynamic and you really get to understand them a lot better than over a Zoom call, and so I always prefer that. We've invested in companies that we haven't met in person yet, and then later on we meet in person and like a 30-minute coffee ends up being a 3-hour coffee, and you're like, yes, I made the right decision, this was great.
What are the Frontier pop-ups? Tell us.
Yeah, so Frontiers pop-ups, they're new. I've been doing our annual summit. We're coming up on our third one, Frontiers, and the idea there's twofold. One is to truly talk about the frontier of technology and biology and TechBio, but then the other piece of that is to really bring people that are building, investing, supporting early stage companies together. And so this is our flagship in-person here in Nashville conference. And what we realized was there's an opportunity to kind of build these mini pockets. And so I'll be in San Francisco soon, and we're hosting our first Frontiers pop-up, which will be a lot of fun. And the idea is to structure a similar micro moment of Frontiers by bringing, again, just really good people in a good space and encouraging connections and dialogue. And often I know a lot of the people that are attending, it's like, oh, Alex, you need to talk to this person, and you guys need to connect, and I just kind of step away, and good things happen.
I love that. My last question. When you see the deck and everything on paper looks good, but you're not still sure, should we invest or not? Do you use your intuition, your gut feeling to make that decision, or just numbers?
Oh, I believe in the gut feeling for so many reasons. One, gut microbiome, right? There's some real gut-brain axis, there's some science there. But truly, if you think about the way that machine learning models are built and trained, right? We're taking in information, we're building our own mental model and then processing that. So I'm a firm believer that gut feeling, that first instinct that you have, sometimes you might not have all of the data to support it. because your brain, just like a machine learning algorithm, is a black box. But if you give that the time and energy, that feeling or whatever that gut response is, typically you'll be right, because something in your machine learning model in your mind is saying, hey, red flag, hey, this is a signal we've seen before, even if we can't quantify it. And usually it's a multidimensional signal, which is usually why we can't say, oh, well, this person we wouldn't want to invest because of this one reason. Maybe it's these 3 reasons happening at the same time, and that convergence is the signal. But that's the machine learning in our brain, and sometimes it's hard to convey that in person. So no, I'm a big believer, but at the same time,
I like that you still have logic behind your gut feeling. So it's not really gut feeling, but you have logic behind it anyway.
Once a data scientist, always a data scientist.
That's funny. At the very end, I ask our guests to give some sort of recommendations to startup founders. I used to ask about digital health specifically, but today let's focus on TechBio founders. What one last piece of advice would you give them in order to be successful?
Meet as many people as you can. If you're not out networking, and networking is such a broad term, but truly every single job I've ever had, everyone who's ever invested in me has been through first that connection and that human connection point, and then it's led to good business, good outcomes in some way, shape, or form. And truly, those are so unpredictable. So on one hand, absolutely be intentional who you're meeting and all of that. But if you're not carving out time and energy to go and just connect with other humans in your ecosystem, and more importantly, outside of your ecosystem, you are missing so much potential.
That's perfect. So Frontier, Popups, healthtech, and there are lots of other amazing events happening all over the world. So please, instead of just watching Netflix in the evening, just find an event that is happening near you and just go.
And you do a great job of that, by the way.
Thank you. You too.